Hey guys, tonight we are embarking on a rather epic voyage back to the Age of Discovery, a time when the world map still had vast, tantalizingly blank spaces, and the prospect of encountering marvels, or monsters, was very real in the minds of intrepid explorers. We're joining the fleet of Ferdinand Magellan as he sails into the largely unknown waters of the southern hemisphere, and we're going to delve into why this famously determined and perhaps a little bit grim navigator came to believe that a land of giants existed at the very tip of South America. Imagine yourself on the deck of a creaking wooden carrack, the endless ocean stretching in every direction, the stars above, unfamiliar, and the air thick with anticipation, fear, and the scent of adventure, and possibly very large footprints. And honestly, given the conditions of a 16th century sea voyage, the scurvy, the storms, the truly awful food, and the distinct lack of Wi-Fi, you probably wouldn't survive the journey to Patagonia, let alone an encounter with alleged 9-foot-tall locals. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as you settle in, maybe drop a comment to let us know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's always a delight to see our global community of history buffs and curious dreamers gathering. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The year is 1519. You find yourself a reluctant or perhaps keenly adventurous member of a 5-ship fleet under the command of the Portuguese mariner Fernão de Magalhães, or Ferdinand Magellan, as he's more commonly known to us English speakers, sailing under the Spanish flag. The scent of salt, tar, damp wood, and unwashed humanity is your constant companion. The creak and groan of the ship's timbers, the snap of canvas in the wind, the rough shouts of sailors in a medley of European languages. This is the soundtrack to your days and nights. You are leaving the familiar world behind, heading south, ever south, into waters largely uncharted by Europeans on an audacious mission. Ferdinand Magellan's expedition was a monumental undertaking, its primary goal to find a westward sea route to the fabulously wealthy Spice Islands, the Moluccas, by navigating around or through the great, largely unknown landmass of South America. A feat never before accomplished, and one many deemed impossible. This was the very heart of the Age of Discovery, or perhaps more accurately from other perspectives, the Age of European Expansion. It was an era of breathtaking ambition, of incredible bravery, and often of profound misunderstanding and brutality. The world map as known to Europeans was a work in progress full of seductive Kong-bai, blank spaces, and speculative coastlines. Vast swaths of the globe were simply labeled terra incognita, unknown land. And in the minds of many, these unknown lands were not presumed to be empty or ordinary. They were realms where anything was possible, where the marvels and monsters described in classical texts, medieval romances, and a burgeoning genre of fantastical travelers' tales might actually exist. You might find the Fountain of Youth, the golden city of El Dorado Islands, ruled by Amazonian warrior women, or indeed races of giants or men with heads in their chests. The world was still enchanted, still capable of yielding wonders that would astound Christendom. Those blank spots on the map weren't just geographical voids. They were reservoirs of the incredible, often labeled with, "Here be dragons," or more realistically, "Here be stuff we really hope isn't too bitey but probably is." Magellan himself was a complex figure, stern, deeply religious, incredibly determined, and not a man to suffer fools or mutineers gladly. He had already sailed the eastern seas in Portuguese service, so he was no stranger to long, perilous voyages. But this venture was on another scale entirely. He was sailing into the teeth of the unknown, driven by a potent mix of motives. Historians still argue whether Magellan himself was primarily driven by the promise of the immense commercial wealth a new route to the Spice Islands would bring to Spain, by the pure pursuit of geographical knowledge and the personal glory of such a discovery, or by a complex amalgamation that also included fulfilling the geopolitical ambitions of his patron, the young King Charles I of Spain, soon to be Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. Whatever his primary motivation, it required an iron will. And for the men aboard those ships, a motley collection of Spaniards, Portuguese, Italians, French, Germans, Greeks, and others, the journey was one of extreme hardship, punctuated by boredom, fear, and the ever-present specter of starvation, disease, and death. As they ventured further and further from familiar shores into colder, stormier latitudes, their psychological state would have been a potent mix of apprehension and a heightened expectation of encountering the truly bizarre. You might notice some of the older, more superstitious sailors on deck, casting wary eyes at the flight patterns of the albatrosses and petrels following the ship, muttering about how their strange dips and cries could foretell encounters with either wondrous new lands or truly monstrous beings. It was less scientific weather forecasting and more a kind of avian anxiety projection. In such an environment, with the known world shrinking behind you and the unknown looming vast and menacing ahead, the mind becomes fertile ground for believing in marvels. The ordinary rules seem to bend, and the possibility of encountering giants, a notion already present in European folklore and classical literature, wouldn't have seemed nearly as outlandish to Magellan and his men as it does to us today. They were in a very real sense sailing into a world where myth and reality were still very much in conversation. You're now aboard Magellan's creaking vessel, part of that intrepid if somewhat apprehensive crew, sailing into the vast, beckoning unknown of the early 16th century. The very air you breathe seems thick with the promise of discovery, the thrill of the uncharted. To truly understand why a seasoned navigator like Magellan, and indeed his entire crew, might readily believe in the existence of giants. In a far-off land, we need to immerse ourselves a little deeper into the prevailing mindset of their era, particularly how they saw the world represented on their maps and described in their most revered texts. Their world was not yet fully charted, measured, and demystified as ours is today. It was a place still brimming with ancient marvels and monstrous possibilities. Imagine looking over Magellan's shoulder at one of the precious hand-drawn portolan charts, or a printed map of the era. These maps were for their time marvels of information detailing known coastlines, ports, and rum lines for navigation. But as your eye drifted towards the edges of the known world, the unexplored interiors of continents, the distant rumored islands, or the vast, icy southern regions, the geographical certainty would often give way to fascinating and sometimes frankly terrifying speculation. European maps of the 15th and 16th centuries, heavily influenced by classical geographers like Ptolemy, whose Geographia had been rediscovered, and was hugely influential and embellished by tales from medieval travelogues, like the wildly popular Travels of Sir John Mandeville, frequently depicted these unexplored parts of the globe as inhabited by what were known as the monstrous races or Plinian races, named after the Roman author Pliny the Elder, whose natural history described many such wonders. If you didn't know what was actually in a particular far-flung region, giant with one enormous foot was apparently a perfectly reasonable placeholder for the mapmakers. These weren't just vague warnings of, "Here be dragons." Those sea monsters certainly writhed in the decorative oceans of these maps. No, the land itself was often populated with illustrations of quite specific and rather startling beings. You might see depictions of the cyopods or monopods, men who possessed only a single enormous foot which they reputedly used with great dexterity to hop around and more impressively to shield themselves from the sun by lying on their backs and holding their giant foot aloft like a personal parasol. Some mapmakers even got quite into the logistics of this one-footed sunbathing, drawing them in rather relaxed if anatomically improbable poses. Then there were the Blemiae, a race of headless men whose faces, eyes, nose, and mouth were disconcertingly located in their chests. Or the cynocephaly, men with the heads of dogs who were said to bark rather than speak. You might find illustrations of men with ears so large they could wrap themselves in them for warmth. Or the Antipodeans, who supposedly lived on the opposite side of the world with their feet pointing against yours. A concept that was still the subject of some theological debate about whether they could even exist or be saved. And crucially for our story tales and depictions of giants, men of colossal stature, were a recurring motif drawing on biblical stories of Goliath or Gog and Magog, classical myths of titans and cyclopes, and medieval romances filled with towering knights and ogres. These weren't necessarily considered to be pure fantasy by everyone who saw these maps or read these accounts. The authority of classical writers like Pliny Herodotus and later medieval compilers like Isidore of Seville was immense. If these respected ancient and medieval scholars described such peoples, then there was a strong presumption that they must exist somewhere, probably in those conveniently distant unexplored lands. The degree to which highly educated individuals and the cartographers of the early 16th century themselves believed in the literal physical existence of all these depicted marvels and monstrous races versus employing them as conventional decorative fillers for unknown regions. Allegorical representations of the other, or simply as a way to make their expensive maps more commercially appealing and wondrous to buyers, is still a subject of academic discussion among historians of cartography and science. But for the average sailor, and perhaps even for a commander like Magellan, the possibility was very real. So, as Magellan's fleet ventured into uncharted southern latitudes, they weren't just sailing into a geographical void. They were sailing into a space that their cultural imagination had already populated with wonders and horrors. They were, in a sense, primed to expect the unexpected, the extraordinary, the monstrous. If you are consistently told that the further you travel from the civilized center of your world, the stranger and more marvelous or terrifying life becomes, then encountering a race of unusually tall people might very easily be interpreted through that lens, magnified into true giantdom. It's a kind of confirmation bias, writ large on a global scale. The explorers were in many ways hoping to find marvels to justify the immense risks and costs of their voyages, and to bring back tales that would astound their royal patrons and the public alike. Magellan and his crew were products of this worldview, sailing with charts that hinted at marvels, and with minds already half expecting to find them. Their world was one where the boundaries between myth and reality, especially at the distant edges of the map, were wonderfully and sometimes dangerously porous. You're now mentally equipped with the 16th century explorer's worldview, your imagination populated with the strange and wondrous creatures that medieval maps and ancient texts promised existed in the uncharted corners of the globe. With such expectations shaping your perception, you, alongside Magellan and his crew, are ready to venture forth. But the journey southward into these largely unknown seas was no gentle cruise towards discovery. It was a grueling, protracted ordeal, an experience that would test the limits of human endurance and quite possibly warp the very lens through which these men viewed the world, making them all the more receptive to believing in the truly bizarre. As Magellan's 5 small ships, the Trinidad, San Antonio, Concepcion, Victoria, and Santiago, left the familiar waters of the Atlantic behind after departing Spain in September 1519, they sailed into a realm of increasing hardship. Imagine the relentless Atlantic storms, towering waves crashing over the decks, the ships groaning and creaking as if they might splinter apart at any moment. You'd be clinging on for dear life, soaked to the bone, the wind howling like a banshee, wondering if each sunrise would be your last. These were not the sleek, powerful vessels of later centuries. They were relatively small, wooden, and profoundly vulnerable to the ocean's fury. Then there was the food and water, or rather the increasingly grim state of it. Fresh provisions spoiled quickly. The water stored in those wooden casks we've discussed in other historical contexts would become slimy and foul, often teeming with things you'd rather not inspect too closely. The staple food was the infamous ship's biscuit or hardtack, baked to rock-like consistency to prevent mold, but so hard it was often infested with weevils, affectionately or perhaps despairingly termed ship's mutton by some sailors. This biscuit was less a satisfying foodstuff and more a daily dental challenge with the weevils, providing an unwelcome if perhaps tiny source of extra protein. Salted meat and fish, the other mainstays, would become rancid and stringy over time. Hunger, thirst, and the gnawing discomfort of malnutrition were constant companions. Scurvy, that dreaded scourge of long sea voyages caused by a lack of vitamin C, would begin to make its presence felt, though its worst devastation for Magellan's crew would come later during the Pacific crossing. Even in these earlier stages, you might see men growing lethargic, their gums becoming sore and spongy, old wounds reopening. A creeping, debilitating malaise that drained strength and morale. Add to this the cramped, overcrowded conditions below deck, poor sanitation, and the inevitable spread of other diseases, and you have a recipe for profound misery. The early stages of Magellan's voyage were indeed plagued by these severe hardships, a relentless assault on the physical and mental well-being of every man aboard. And the sheer mind-numbing monotony broken only by moments of stark terror during storms weeks. Then months would pass with nothing to see but the endless expanse of water and sky. To combat this, and perhaps the creeping dread of the unknown, sailors might engage in elaborate storytelling sessions during their few off-watch hours. You could imagine them huddled together in the dim light of a swaying lantern, each trying to outdo the other with tales of ghosts, phantom ships, mermaids, krakens, or distant lands with truly bizarre inhabitants, effectively hyping themselves up for whatever marvels or terrors the next unknown horizon might hold. It was the 16th century equivalent of a collective, slightly unhinged, and definitely not safe for work podcast creation session fueled by desperation and bad rum. This prolonged isolation and extreme hardship inevitably took a psychological toll. The precise psychological impact that such conditions combined with intense fear and profound separation from the known world had on the observational accuracy and interpretive frameworks of Magellan, his officers, and the common sailors during this arduous voyage is of course difficult to fully quantify from our modern perspective, but it remains a subject of intense interest for maritime historians and historical psychologists. When you are starved, sick, terrified, and utterly cut off from everything familiar, your perception of reality can become flexible. For Magellan, there was an added layer of pressure. As a Portuguese captain commanding a largely Spanish fleet on a Spanish-funded expedition, he faced suspicion, jealousy, and outright hostility from some of his Spanish officers, who resented his authority. This undercurrent of tension boiled over as the fleet reached the coast of what is now Argentina and sought a place to winter over as the southern latitudes grew colder at Port St. Julian. In March of 1520, a full-blown mutiny erupted, led by some of his most senior captains. Magellan's response was swift and ruthless. He suppressed the rebellion with brutal efficiency, executing some ringleaders, marooning others, and reasserting his iron control over the fleet. Magellan's HR department clearly wasn't quite up to snuff in those days, leading to some rather extreme performance reviews with keelhauling or summary execution as potential and often utilized outcomes. This violent internal conflict occurring just before their first reported encounters with the giants would have created an even more charged and volatile atmosphere among the crew. Fear, suspicion, and a desperate need for the voyage to yield something truly remarkable, something to justify all the suffering, the bloodshed, and the risk, would have been palpable as they anchored in that desolate, wind-swept bay at the very edge of what felt like the world, their minds already steeped in tales of monstrous races from those old maps and legends. The crew was perhaps more ready than ever to encounter and to believe in the truly extraordinary. They were sailing into a world that their imaginations and their hardships had already prepared for marvels. You're now anchored in the grim, tense atmosphere of Port St. Julian, that desolate bay on the Patagonian coast in the autumn of 1520. The mutiny has been brutally quashed by Magellan, its leaders executed or marooned, and a heavy pall of fear and resentment hangs over the remaining crew. 2 of the 5 ships have already been lost to rebellion or wreck. The southern winter is closing in, the days growing shorter, colder, and the prospect of finding that elusive passage to the Spice Islands seems more distant and desperate than ever. It is in this charged, isolated, and profoundly alien environment that Magellan and his men would first encounter the land that would give birth to a legend of giants. As you gaze out from the deck of your cramped, creaking vessel, your first impressions of Patagonia are likely to be ones of immense, almost overwhelming desolation. This is not the lush, vibrant, tropical paradise some might have dreamt of finding in the New World. Instead, you are greeted by vast, windswept plains stretching as far as the eye can see, largely treeless, clad in coarse grasses and low, hardy shrubs that huddle close to the stony ground. The region of Patagonia, when first encountered by Magellan's expedition as they established their winter quarters at Port St. Julian in late March 1520, presented a stark, cold, and seemingly empty landscape dominated by these arid steppes and subject to harsh weather conditions. The sky above is enormous, often a pale, steely gray, or perhaps a brilliant, brittle blue that offers no warmth. The coastline is rugged with forbidding cliffs and long, empty beaches pounded by the relentless surf of the South Atlantic. The wind is your constant companion here, a biting, ceaseless presence that howls across the plains, chilling you to the bone and making even simple tasks on deck a struggle. It doesn't just blow, it seems to have a personal vendetta against your already frayed sanity and any attempt you might make at maintaining a remotely decent hairstyle. The main leisure activity for many of the crew probably quickly became competitive shivering, punctuated by gloomy speculation about what unknown horrors, or perhaps what desperate salvation lay just over the next bleak, windswept hill. For weeks after their arrival, Magellan's men saw no signs of human life. This profound emptiness, this utter lack of visible habitation in such a vast land, would have been deeply unsettling. They were accustomed to landscapes, however wild, that usually bore some mark of human presence. Here there was just the wind, the cries of unfamiliar seabirds like penguins and cormorants, the barking of sea lions on distant rocks, and an overwhelming, almost unnerving silence from the land itself. It felt like the very end of the earth, a place forgotten by God and man. You can imagine some of the more jumpy crew members, their nerves already shattered by the voyage, and the recent mutiny attributing every oddly shaped rock formation in the distance, or every dust devil whipped up by the wind, to some lurking behemoth, or a sleeping giant just waiting for them to get a bit too complacent. "Did you see that rock move, Juan?" one might whisper. "No, Pedro, that was a very large, very stationary rock, just like yesterday." "Are you absolutely sure it didn't twitch?" This sense of desolation and isolation would have profoundly impacted the psychological state of the crew. Remember those medieval maps we talked about, the ones hinting at monstrous races and bizarre phenomena at the fringes of the known world? This Patagonian landscape, so stark and seemingly empty, could easily have felt like one of those very fringes. A place where the ordinary rules of nature no longer applied, and where anything, including encounters with giants, was not just possible, but perhaps even expected. The initial apparent emptiness of the Patagonian coastline encountered by Magellan's crew at Port St. Julian, whether it was primarily due to the seasonal migration patterns of the indigenous Tehuelche groups moving further inland to escape the coastal winter, the naturally sparse population density of this vast region, or simply the Europeans' limited initial reconnaissance beyond their immediate anchorage, is a point that anthropologists and historical geographers continue to consider. Whatever the reason for Magellan's men, it created a vacuum, and the human mind, especially when stressed and steeped in folklore, abhors a vacuum. It tends to fill it with its own fears and expectations. Some of the more superstitious sailors might have held the belief that such extremely desolate or silent lands were often guarded by powerful unseen spirits, or were places where the veil between the world of the living and other stranger realms was perilously thin. They might have interpreted the strange, echoing cries of seals from hidden coves, or the unfamiliar calls of flightless rheas glimpsed in the distance, as the voices of these uncanny guardians, adding another layer of eerie apprehension to the already intimidating atmosphere. The landscape itself seemed to be watching them, waiting. This vast empty welcome, therefore, was not a neutral experience. It was a powerful psychological primer. The endless plains could make a man feel incredibly small and vulnerable, a tiny speck in an indifferent immensity. Or, for a mind already expecting wonders, it could be a stage perfectly set for the appearance of something truly out of the ordinary, something on a scale that matched the landscape itself. As they huddled in their ships through the increasingly cold days and long nights of that Patagonian autumn and early winter, their rations dwindling, their hopes perhaps fading, the anticipation for something to happen, for some sign, any sign of what this strange new world held, must have been almost unbearable. And it is onto this stage of desolation, tension, and heightened expectation that the first giant would soon make his dramatic entrance. You're now huddled with Magellan's crew in the desolate, windswept haven of Port St. Julian, the Patagonian winter of 1520, biting at your bones. The aftermath of the mutiny still hangs heavy in the air, a grim reminder of Magellan's iron will, and the desperation that simmers just beneath the surface of this long, arduous voyage. Weeks have dragged by in this seemingly empty land, nearly 2 months of seeing nothing but barren plains, gray skies, and the churning, inhospitable sea. The ships are being repaired, meager rations are being consumed, and a tense, watchful monotony has likely set in. And it's precisely into this atmosphere of weary expectation and underlying dread that the truly extraordinary, the moment that would ignite a centuries-long legend, finally arrives. Our primary window into this encounter, and indeed into much of Magellan's voyage, comes from the meticulous journal kept by Antonio Pigafetta. He was a Venetian scholar and knight, a supernumerary volunteer on the expedition driven by a thirst for adventure and a keen intellect. Pigafetta served as Magellan's assistant, and his detailed chronicle is the most comprehensive and vivid first-hand account we have of this circumnavigation, including these first fateful encounters with the people of Patagonia. So, as you stand on the deck, peering towards the desolate shoreline, you are essentially seeing this through Pigafetta's observant, if culturally biased, 16th-century European eyes. Imagine the scene. It's a cold day, perhaps late May or early June by our calendar. The crew is engaged in their usual dreary tasks, mending sails, fetching brackish water, trying to catch a few fish or seabirds. Suddenly a cry goes up. A figure has appeared on the shore, seemingly from nowhere, a lone man silhouetted against the bleak horizon. And he is, by all accounts, astonishingly tall. Pigafetta describes him as being so tall that we only came up to his waist, a striking, if almost certainly exaggerated claim. This man wasn't just standing there. He was, according to Pigafetta, dancing and leaping and singing, and while he sang and leaped, he put the sand and dust upon his head. It must have been an utterly bizarre and startling sight for these Europeans so far from home, in a land they believed to be utterly uninhabited. His dance was probably less strictly come dancing, and more, what on earth is that alarming energetic jig, and does it mean he's friendly or about to eat us? From the sailor's immediate perspective, this lone figure was clad in animal skins, his face painted, his feet large and wrapped in furs, an appearance utterly alien to Magellan's men. His sudden materialization, his sheer perceived size, and his strange exuberant behavior would have sent a shockwave of astonishment, fear, and perhaps even a thrill of vindication through the fleet. Here at last was one of the marvels their era had primed them to expect in such remote corners of the earth. Magellan, ever cautious but also undoubtedly intrigued, reacted. He ordered one of his men, a brave or perhaps simply expendable sailor, to go ashore and make contact, instructing him to mimic the man's dancing and gestures as a sign of peace and friendship. Magellan's first contact protocol apparently involved sending one poor fellow out to see if the large, gesticulating stranger was genuinely friendly or just really hangry after a long winter. The sailor did as he was told, and this seemed to reassure the tall man on the shore, who then allowed himself to be led towards a small island where Magellan himself had landed to await developments. The exact date of this pivotal first encounter and the precise sequence of the initial gestures and attempts at communication between Magellan's crew and this lone Patagonian man are subject to some minor variations and interpretations when comparing different scholarly editions and analyses of Pigafetta's original manuscript and other condensed contemporary accounts. But the core of the story, the sudden appearance of a giant, remains consistent. Pigafetta recounts how this man marveled at the ship, at the Europeans' appearance, and at the items they showed him. One particularly charming and very human detail he records is the man's reaction to being shown a looking glass. When this tall Patagonian saw his own reflection for the first time, he was, according to Pigafetta, greatly terrified thereby, and starting back, he overthrew 2 of our men that stood about him. It's a wonderfully candid moment. Not the reaction of some fearsome, monstrous giant, but of someone encountering a piece of technology and a concept, a perfect, clear reflection of oneself completely outside their experience. It's a slightly comical image, this towering figure leaping back in alarm from his own face. A brief moment of shared, startled humanity amidst the profound cultural chasm. From this very first encounter, the label giant was firmly affixed. It wasn't just his height, though, that was clearly impressive to the shorter Europeans of the 16th century. It was his overall build, the unfamiliarity of his attire and painted skin, the otherness of him in this vast, intimidating landscape. They were primed by their maps, their legends, and the sheer psychological pressure of their voyage to see something extraordinary. And in this tall, dancing man on a desolate shore, they found it. The seed of the Patagonian giant legend had been sown not by a monster, but by a man seen through the wide, astonished, and culturally conditioned eyes of Magellan's men. You've just witnessed, through the astonished eyes of Antonio Pigafetta and Magellan's crew, the sudden, almost theatrical appearance of that lone, towering figure on the desolate Patagonian shore. His sheer perceived size, his strange attire of animal skins, and his exuberant dust-throwing dance immediately set him apart, planting the first seeds of the giant legend. But a legend often needs a name to truly take root and flourish. And it was Magellan himself, according to Pigafetta, who bestowed upon these people the evocative and enduring moniker that would forever link them with colossal stature, the Patagoni or Patagonians. And the story behind that name, whether true or a product of later interpretation, only served to amplify the giant myth. Pigafetta. Our diligent chronicler records that Magellan called these people Patagoni. The most popular and widely circulated explanation for this name, the one that has stuck in the public imagination for centuries, is that it derives from the Spanish or Portuguese word pata, meaning foot, or paw, combined with an augmentative suffix like on, effectively meaning big feet or land of the big feet. Dunley. So from this perspective, Magellan wasn't just calling them tall, he was specifically remarking on the impressive size of their feet. It's a bit like assuming anyone who wears a particularly large hat must by definition possess an equally enormous brain. Not always a reliable correlation, as history has occasionally demonstrated. Now, why Big Feet Pigafetta describes the native people as wrapping their feet in the skins of guanacos, a llama-like animal native to the region, for warmth, creating a kind of bulky, oversized footwear. It's easy to imagine how these fur-wrapped extremities, perhaps leaving large splayed prints in the soft sand or mud of the shoreline, could have appeared disproportionately massive to the Europeans, whose own leather shoes would have been more close-fitting. If you encountered people whose footprints looked like they belonged to a small bear, Bigfoot, or Patagon, might indeed seem like a perfectly logical descriptor. This is a mainstream historical fact. The name Patagones, or Patagonians, was bestowed by Magellan's expedition upon the indigenous inhabitants of the region they wintered in. While Antonio Pigafetta's account is the primary source for the name, its precise etymology remains debated, with the most popular and long-standing theory linking it to the Spanish word pata, foot, supposedly referring to the large appearance of their feet, possibly due to their fur-wrapped footwear or large footprints observed by the explorers. Once you've labeled a people the big-footed ones, it's a very short mental leap to assuming everything else about them is proportionally oversized. The name itself becomes a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy in the minds of those who use it and those who hear the tales. It primes the listener, and indeed the observer, to look for and emphasize any evidence of great stature while perhaps downplaying or ignoring contradictory information. The word Patagonian quickly became synonymous with giant in the European consciousness, a powerful linguistic seed from which a mighty legend grew. However, the precise linguistic root and intended meaning of Magellan's term Patagon remain a subject of lively debate and considerable scholarly detective work among historians, linguists, and literary scholars. The big feet theory, while appealingly straightforward, is not without its challengers. Another compelling and rather more romantic theory suggests that Magellan, or perhaps Pigafetta himself, might have drawn the name from a then hugely popular Spanish chivalric romance titled Prima León de Grecia, first published in 1512, just a few years before Magellan's voyage. This epic tale featured a monstrous, savage, dog-headed giant character named Pathagon, or sometimes Patagon. Given that chivalric romances were the blockbuster entertainment of the early 16th century, akin to our superhero movies or fantasy sagas, it's highly probable that Magellan and his educated officers would have been familiar with this character. So upon encountering these tall, wild-looking people in a strange and distant land, they might have exclaimed, "They are like Pathagon," or simply labeled them the Patagons in reference to this literary monster. If this theory is correct, then the name was less a literal description of their feet and more a direct, almost playful allusion to a pre-existing fictional giant, immediately casting the encountered people in a mythic, larger-than-life role. It's like Magellan was basically naming them after a character from his era's equivalent of a popular comic book. Behold Captain America gone and his amazing friends. There have been other more obscure linguistic suggestions, too. One rather amusing, though thoroughly debunked, folk etymology that circulated in later centuries proposed that Patagones came from Magellan, or one of his men exclaiming in surprise upon seeing their large footprints, something along the lines of "Ah, que patacuna," in Spanish, supposedly meaning, "Ah, what big cub-like paws/feet," which then got mangled and shortened over time. It sounds like a line from a slightly bewildered tourist in a bad comedy sketch trying to describe a large dog, but it illustrates how eagerly people sought to reinforce that Bigfoot connection, however tenuous the linguistic gymnastics involved. Regardless of which etymological theory holds the most truth, whether it was genuinely about observed big feet, a literary nod to a fictional giant, or something else entirely, the power of the name Patagonian was immense. It immediately conjured images of colossal beings, an idea that captured the European imagination and fit perfectly with the age of discovery's expectation of finding marvels and monsters at the world's end. The name became a label, and that label repeated in Pigafetta's widely read chronicle and subsequent accounts helped to build shape and perpetuate the myth of the Patagonian giants for hundreds of years, long after Magellan's battered Victoria had completed its historic circumnavigation. It was a name that promised something extraordinary, and for centuries many were more than willing to believe. You're now standing on the shores of Port St. Julian, the name Patagon, with all its big-footed, giant-implying connotations, freshly coined by Magellan or echoing in his mind from some chivalric romance. This label, whether a descriptive attempt or a literary flourish, has already begun to shape the European perception of the people they are about to interact with more closely. That first lone figure with his startling dance and imposing stature was just the prelude. Now, as more of Magellan's men venture ashore, or as more of these Patagons emerge from the desolate landscape, the surreal and cautious first encounters begin in earnest. Imagine the scene still through the observant, if inevitably biased, eyes of Antonio Pigafetta. That first tall man having been somewhat reassured by the sailor who mimicked his enthusiastic dust-throwing dance. A performance that was probably less a culturally sensitive greeting and more a "What in the name of all that is holy are those floating wooden islands with weird pale things on them?" dances eventually coaxed towards Magellan. Perhaps he's lured by the sight of unfamiliar trinkets, or simply by an overwhelming curiosity that overcomes his initial apprehension. He is brought aboard one of the ships or to Magellan's temporary encampment on a small island in the bay. The sheer size of the vessel, its complex rigging, its cannons, all would have been utterly alien, and no doubt awe-inspiring or perhaps terrifying to someone from a non-maritime nomadic culture. Communication, of course, is a significant hurdle. There's no shared language, no convenient translation app for 16th century Patagonian dialects. Every interaction is a slow, painstaking process of gestures, pointing, and mimicry with ample room for misunderstanding on both sides. You can picture Magellan stern and imposing, trying to convey peaceful intentions, while also asserting his authority. His men would be a mixture of fear-excitement and probably a good deal of bravado, trying to make sense of these people who seem to have stepped directly from the pages of those fantastical travelogues or the monstrous margins of their maps. Pigafetta meticulously records these early interactions, including the exchange of gifts, a classic feature of first encounters between European explorers and indigenous peoples. During these initial peaceful meetings at Port St. Julian, Magellan's men offered the Patagonian individuals food and drink from their own dwindling stores, and more enticingly, European trinkets. Small hawk's bells that tinkled merrily, little round mirrors that threw back distorted reflections of their painted faces, brightly colored glass beads, and simple combs. Items of little intrinsic value to the Europeans, but sources of immense wonder and delight to people who had never seen such things. Pigafetta amusingly describes one of the tall men being so utterly captivated by a small steel looking-glass that he carefully guarded it, clutching it as if it were a great treasure, perhaps thinking he'd managed to capture a tiny, very handsome, and surprisingly pale European soul within its reflective surface. It was the 16th century equivalent of being gifted the latest smartphone, eliciting a similar level of astonished fascination. In return, the Patagonians offered what they had, perhaps pieces of guanaco meat, or demonstrated their skills with their bows and arrows. These exchanges, however small, were crucial stepping stones, fragile bridges across a vast cultural and linguistic divide. The Patagonians got a comb and a few shiny beads. Magellan and Pigafetta got a really good story, and the confirmation of a race of giants which would make for excellent reading back in Europe. Seems like a fair trade if you're the one writing the history books. The precise nature and intended meaning of the Patagonians' initial dancing and singing upon first seeing the Europeans, as Pigafetta described it, whether it was a form of ritualistic greeting intended to establish peaceful contact, an expression of profound surprise, or even alarm at the sight of such strange visitors and their massive canoes, a shamanistic display meant to engage with or ward off unfamiliar spirits, or some other culturally specific behavior, are interpreted differently by anthropologists and ethnohistorians today, given the unfortunate lack of direct Tehuelche testimony from that specific encounter. For the Europeans, it likely just added to the overall impression of encountering a wild, primitive, and remarkably large people. As more Patagonians appeared, including Pigafetta notes, women who were also very tall, though not as tall as the men. He reassures his readers perhaps to maintain some semblance of European gender norms. Even in this land of giants, the initial descriptions solidified. They were consistently described as being clad in sewn animal skins, particularly those of the guanaco, which covered their bodies from head to their famously large fur-wrapped feet. Their faces were often painted with striking patterns, and their hair was typically short and also sometimes painted or whitened with a kind of powder. Each interaction, each shared gesture, each exchanged item would have been freighted with meaning and just as often with misinterpretation. The Europeans, already primed by their cultural baggage and the desolation of the land, were seeing giants. The Tehuelche people, as these indigenous groups would later be more accurately known, were encountering beings from an entirely different world with unfathomable technology and equally strange customs. It was a surreal dance of cautious curiosity, underlying fear, and the dawning on the European side, at least, of a legend in the making. You've now navigated those first tentative and utterly surreal encounters between Magellan's men and the people they would christen Patagonians. Some. The gift exchanges have happened, the cautious dances have been danced, and the initial shock of seeing these tall, skin-clad figures on a desolate shore is beginning to morph into a more detailed, if still highly subjective, observation. As Antonio Pigafetta and his shipmates spent more time in Port St. Julian, encountering more of these individuals, their descriptions began to solidify, painting a picture of a people who, in European eyes at least, were nothing short of titanic. It's in these contemporary accounts, particularly Pigafetta's, that the legend of the Patagonian giants truly begins to take on its impressive, if exaggerated, dimensions. Pigafetta, our keen-eyed Venetian chronicler, doesn't mince words when it comes to their stature. He famously and repeatedly describes the Patagonians as being of such immense height that an average European man, and 16th century Europeans were on average a bit shorter than many modern populations, only reached their waist or at best their chest. He even attempts a more precise, if still somewhat dubious estimation, suggesting somewhere around 9 or 10 spans tall, which, depending on how you interpret a span, the distance from the tip of the thumb to the tip of the little finger, when the hand is spread, could translate to anywhere from 7 to over 9 or even 12 feet. His internal measuring tape might have been slightly recalibrated by sheer astonishment, the desire to report marvels back home, and perhaps a touch of, I really want this story to be amazing when I tell it at parties. The reliability of Pigafetta's specific estimations of the Patagonians' height and how much these figures were a result of genuine observation of exceptionally tall individuals from the Tehuelche groups. Subjective exaggeration influenced by awe or fear, or even a deliberate embellishment to enhance the wondrous nature of the expedition's discoveries, is still actively debated by historians and anthropologists, examining his text and the context of 16th century travel writing. But it wasn't just their height that impressed and intimidated the Europeans. Pigafetta and other, albeit scarcer, accounts also paint a picture of immense strength and robust physique. These were not lanky, willowy giants. They were described as being well-proportioned for their great size, with broad shoulders and powerful limbs. Their daily life hunting guanaco and rhea on foot across the vast plains would have certainly built considerable strength and endurance. You can imagine Magellan's men, many of them weakened by months at sea, poor diet, and the psychological strain of their voyage, looking upon these vigorous, well-adapted people with a mixture of admiration and trepidation. Every sinew, every movement might have seemed to confirm their superhuman, titan-like qualities. Their voices, too, contributed to this larger-than-life image. Pigafetta claimed that one of the first giants they encountered had a voice that was louder and stronger than that of a bull. Imagine that. Not just a deep voice, but one that could rival a large, bellowing farm animal. You certainly wouldn't need a megaphone to get their attention from across the bay, just a very brave person to actually deliver the message once you had it. This auditory hyperbole, added to the visual descriptions of their imposing size, would have further solidified the impression of encountering beings who were fundamentally different, operating on a grander, more powerful scale than ordinary mortals. Other physical details filled out the portrait. Their faces were described as broad and often painted sometimes with red ochre around the eyes or with other symbolic designs that would have seemed fierce or bizarre to European sensibilities. Their hair was generally short and coarse, sometimes described as being whitened with a kind of powder or clay. Their attire, as we've noted, consisted mainly of expertly sewn guanaco skins, forming a sort of cloak or robe, and those famously large fur-wrapped bundles on their feet that likely contributed to the Patagon name. Even their hands were noted as being proportionally large. Every detail seen through that lens of initial astonishment seemed to confirm their giant status. It's interesting to note that despite this perception of immense size and strength, Pigafetta often describes their initial demeanor as peaceable, almost childlike, in their wonder at the European trinkets like mirrors and bells. There's a curious duality in his account. These are formidable giants, yet they are also amazed by simple objects and can be frightened by their own reflection. This perhaps made them seem less like inherently malevolent monsters from a medieval bestiary and more like a sort of noble, savage giant, a concept that would have its own complex history in European thought. They were marvelous, perhaps a little alarming, but not necessarily immediately hostile, at least not until Magellan's later, more aggressive interactions. These detailed descriptions penned by an educated eyewitness like Pigafetta were not just idle jottings. They were, in essence, data being collected, proof that would be carried back to Europe to astound scholars, delight royal patrons, and fuel the public's hunger for tales of the wondrous and the bizarre from the newly discovered lands. When Pigafetta wrote of men whose heads the Europeans barely reached, he was crafting a narrative that was almost guaranteed to captivate and convince. The image of the Patagonian giant, built upon these vivid, if likely inflated descriptions, was beginning to loom very large indeed in the European imagination. You've now heard Antonio Pigafetta's rather breathless, if somewhat exaggerated descriptions of the Patagonian people, their towering height, their bull-like voices, their robust strength. These accounts, penned by an educated eyewitness, were destined to solidify the image of these giants in the European mind. But for Ferdinand Magellan, a man of action and perhaps a touch of ruthless pragmatism, merely observing and describing these marvels wasn't quite enough. In the grand tradition of 16th-century explorers, who often saw the New World and its inhabitants as curiosities to be collected and displayed, Magellan hatched a daring if ethically dubious plan. He decided he wanted to capture a couple of these Patagoni and bring them back to Spain as living proof of his discoveries and no doubt as spectacular trophies for his royal patron, King Charles I. This desire to bring back souvenirs, be they exotic plants, strange animals, or tragically human beings, was a common, if often dark, aspect of the Age of Discovery. These living specimens served to validate the explorers' tales, to entertain European courts, and to provide subjects for scholarly and often deeply flawed study. Magellan, for all his navigational genius, was a man of his time, and the thought of presenting a pair of bona fide South American giants to the Spanish king must have seemed like a masterstroke, a way to secure his fame and perhaps further funding for future ventures. His stated reason, according to Pigafetta, was so that they might learn our language, that we might thereafter be able to have their friendship and make them Christians. A noble sentiment on the surface, perhaps, but one that conveniently overlooked the rather coercive methods involved. So after some weeks of these cautious, intermittent interactions and small gift exchanges at Port St. Julian, Magellan set his plan in motion. He aimed to capture two of the younger, seemingly stronger and healthier Patagonian men. The method, as detailed by Pigafetta, was one of cunning deception. You can imagine the scene. Magellan's men approached two such individuals, perhaps luring them with a particularly enticing array of European trinkets. They load these two Patagonians up with gifts: knives, small round mirrors, tinkling hawk's bells, strings of brightly colored glass beads, pressing item after item into their large hands until they can hold no more. Their arms are literally full of these novelties. Then came the masterstroke of treachery. The Europeans produced a set of iron leg shackles, the kind used to restrain prisoners. These heavy, clanking manacles were presented not as instruments of bondage, but as yet another fascinating gift. The Patagonians, according to Pigafetta, were apparently quite taken with the look of the polished iron, perhaps seeing it as another desirable ornament. They indicated through gestures that they would like these too, but their hands were already full of the other presents. No problem. Magellan's men essentially communicated, "We'll put them on your legs for you so you don't have to carry them." and the Patagonians in what Pigafetta describes with a hint of condescension as their simplicity, and ignorance of such devices apparently agreed, allowing the shackles to be clamped around their ankles. Not exactly the souvenir they were hoping for, one imagines. Oh, lovely iron anklets! Do they come with a matching ball and chain, or is that extra? The moment of realization when those heavy iron rings were securely fastened and they understood they were trapped must have been terrifying. Pigafetta recounts that when the two captured men perceived the treachery, they began to struggle and roar, like bulls. He even notes that one of them, in his distress, called out loudly to Setebos, whom Pigafetta understood to be their great devil or chief deity. This mention of Setebos is a fascinating little cultural crumb, one of the few specific names from their language recorded, and a name that would later find its way rather unexpectedly into Shakespeare's play The Tempest, as the god worshipped by the character Caliban. So even in their capture, these giants were contributing to future European literary marvels, albeit involuntarily. The strength of these two captured men, even when shackled, was reportedly immense, requiring many of Magellan's crew to subdue them. This struggle, this display of raw power against the odds, would only have further cemented the Europeans' belief in their extraordinary giant-like capabilities. Meanwhile, other Patagonians who witnessed the capture from a distance, or who soon found out what had happened, were understandably enraged. Any semblance of peaceful relations was shattered. Pigafetta describes how their companions on the shore attempted a rescue, firing arrows at the longboat carrying the captives back to the ships, one of which unfortunately wounded a European sailor in the thigh. It was less, "Let's sit down and discuss this unfortunate misunderstanding over a cup of non-existent tea," and more, "You've just made a very large, very angry, and now very well-armed enemy." The ethical considerations of Magellan's decision to forcibly capture these Patagonian individuals, and how this act aligns with, or deviates from, the broader context of 16th century European colonial encounter protocols and attitudes towards indigenous peoples, continue to be analyzed and debated by historians. By the standards of his own era, it might have been seen by some as a justifiable, if harsh, means to an end, acquiring valuable specimens and potential interpreters. By modern standards, of course, it's an unambiguous act of kidnapping and betrayal. Tragically, Magellan's plan to present these giants to the Spanish court never came to fruition. Neither of the two captured men survived the grueling voyage ahead. One, whom the Spaniards had christened Paul because he was captured on the feast of St. Paul's Conversion, a rather ironic naming given the circumstances, died during the arduous crossing of the Pacific Ocean, likely from disease, malnutrition, and despair. The other, according to some accounts, survived a little longer, perhaps even reaching the Spice Islands, but also perished before the Victoria made its way back to Spain. The living proof of Patagonian giants was lost to the sea, leaving only Pigafetta's vivid and undoubtedly embellished written account to carry the legend forward. Magellan's approach to intercultural gift-giving and specimen collection clearly needed some significant work, especially the surprise bondage and international kidnapping section of his diplomatic protocol. You've just witnessed Magellan's rather cunning and undeniably treacherous plan to capture two of the so-called Patagonian giants, unfold a plan that ended any semblance of peaceful relations and tragically doomed the captives. This act of forcibly taking human beings as living souvenirs or specimens seems shocking to our modern sensibilities, but to understand why Magellan and his men not only did this, but also so readily believed they were dealing with actual giants in the first place, we need to try and peer through their eyes, through the powerful, often distorting cultural lens of 16th century Europeans. Their perceptions were not ours. They were shaped by a unique set of beliefs, assumptions, and a worldview that saw otherness in ways that often led directly to misunderstanding and misrepresentation. When Magellan's fleet sailed, Europe was in the throes of the Renaissance and the early stages of the Age of Discovery. But the medieval mindset, with its strong religious orthodoxies and its reliance on ancient authorities, still held considerable sway. Early European explorers and chroniclers of this period often interpreted the customs, beliefs, and physical characteristics of non-European peoples through a profoundly ethnocentric lens. Their own European Christian culture was in their minds the undisputed pinnacle of civilization, the yardstick against which all other societies were measured and usually found wanting. Anything unfamiliar, a different skin color, a language they couldn't understand, social customs that diverged from their own, a lack of familiar technology, was frequently categorized using classical and biblical notions of barbarians, savages, heathens, or if they were particularly strange-looking, or lived in a sufficiently remote and terrifying land, even monstrous races. Imagine yourself a 16th century sailor steeped in these ideas. You've been told tales of lands where men have heads in their chests or one giant foot. You then encounter people in a desolate, far-off land who are significantly taller than you. The Tehuelche people of Patagonia were indeed a tall group, averaging perhaps around 6 feet or a bit more, which would have seemed very tall to Europeans of that era, who were often considerably shorter, who dress in unfamiliar animal skins, paint their faces in striking patterns, speak an utterly alien tongue, and whose technology seems rudimentary by European standards. No iron, no firearms, no great stone cities as they knew them. It would be almost too easy, too tempting to slot these people into that pre-existing mental category labeled giants or wild men from the edges of the earth. It made the profoundly unfamiliar a little more comprehensible by fitting it, however imperfectly, into a known if mythical framework. The Patagonians' nomadic lifestyle, their reliance on hunting guanaco with bows and arrows, their seemingly simple shelters, all of this would have contrasted sharply with the settled agricultural and increasingly urbanized societies of Europe. This difference could easily be interpreted not as a successful adaptation to a harsh environment, but as a sign of primitiveness or a lack of civilization. The Patagonians probably thought the Europeans sweating in their stuffy woolen doublets and hose in that often cold and windswept climate were the ones dressed rather ridiculously. "Look, Fernando," one might have gestured to another, "that one's wearing brightly colored leg wrappings in this wind most peculiar." The massive communication barrier, of course, exacerbated everything. With no shared language, every gesture, every expression, every action was open to wild misinterpretation. A ritual dance could be seen as a sign of aggression or mindless savagery. A look of confusion or curiosity could be mistaken for dull-wittedness or animalistic simplicity. A warning shout could be interpreted as a monstrous roar. It's incredibly hard to conduct an objective ethnographic study when your primary research method is observe from a distance with considerable apprehension, occasionally offer shiny beads, and then try to kidnap a couple of them. Antonio Pigafetta's chronicle, for all its invaluable detail, and its author's keen observational skills, is undeniably a product of its time and its author's cultural baggage. The extent to which his detailed account of the Patagonians consciously or unconsciously filtered and framed his observations to align with prevailing European stereotypes of wild men at the world's end, or to specifically enhance the marvelousness, and thus the importance of Magellan's discoveries for his European audience, is a key area of ongoing post-colonial critique and literary analysis of his text. When he describes their simplicity in being tricked by the gift of shackles or identifies their deity, Setebos, as their great devil, he is interpreting their culture and beliefs through a distinctly European Christian filter, one that automatically positions them as naive, pagan others. Sometimes European explorers of this era, when encountering an indigenous ritual they didn't understand, perhaps one involving masks, chanting, or ecstatic movement, would immediately label it as devil worship, or evidence of demonic influence purely because it didn't resemble a Sunday service back in Seville or Lisbon. It's the 16th century equivalent of judging an entirely alien culture's deepest philosophical traditions based on one confusing and poorly subtitled TikTok dance you accidentally stumbled upon. The framework for understanding was often simply too narrow, too preconditioned by their own ingrained beliefs about what constituted normal or godly. So when Magellan and his men looked upon the tall Tehuelche people, they weren't just seeing individuals of a different culture. They were seeing figures onto whom they could project their own era's rich tapestry of myths, fears, and expectations about the unknown. The giant was already there waiting in their minds, a legacy of classical lore and medieval fantasy. The desolate Patagonian landscape provided the perfect stage, and the tall, skin-clad Tehuelche, with their unfamiliar ways, provided the perfect cast for this pre-scripted marvel. You're now looking at the tall, skin-clad people of Patagonia through the somewhat distorting, culturally conditioned lens of a 16th century European like Magellan, or his chronicler, Pigafetta. Their unfamiliar appearance, their strange customs, Their very otherness in that desolate landscape all contributed to their being perceived as something extraordinary, something beyond the bounds of ordinary humanity. But this perception wasn't conjured out of thin air purely from the shock of the new. Magellan and his men carried with them a rich cargo of pre-existing stories, ancient myths, and widely accepted historical accounts that specifically spoke of the existence of giants in various parts of the world. These whispers of giants passed echoing from classical antiquity biblical narratives and medieval romances effectively primed their minds to discover and to believe in exactly what they thought they found. In the early 16th century, the intellectual world of Europe was deeply reverent towards the wisdom of the ancients. The writings of Greek and Roman authors rediscovered and disseminated during the Renaissance were considered vital sources of knowledge about history, geography, and the natural world. And these classical texts were by no means silent on the subject of giants. Greek mythology, for instance, was filled with colossal beings, the Titans who battled Zeus for control of the cosmos, the Cyclopes, one-eyed giants like Polyphemus, who famously had a rather unfortunate encounter with Odysseus, and the Gigantes themselves, monstrous earthborn beings, who also waged war against the Olympian gods. These weren't just quaint fireside tales. They were foundational stories that educated Europeans knew well. If such beings existed in the heroic past of their own cultural ancestors, why not in unexplored distant lands today? Then there were the Roman authors, like Pliny the Elder, whose encyclopedic natural history was a treasure trove of information and misinformation about the world. Pliny described various marvelous and monstrous races reputed to live at the fringes of the known world, including at times peoples of exceptional height. His work was considered an authoritative scientific text for centuries, lending credence to the possibility of encountering such human variations. Even more potent and unquestionable for the deeply religious society of 16th century Europe were the accounts of giants found within the Bible itself. The book of Genesis speaks of the Nephilim, or Gibborim, described as giants in the earth in those days, mighty men which were of old men of renown. The story of David and Goliath, the Philistine giant, felled by a shepherd boy's sling, was one of the most famous tales in the Old Testament. Other passages mention giant clans like the Anakim or the Rephaim, for Magellan and his crew who would have attended Mass regularly, and whose worldview was profoundly shaped by Christian doctrine. These biblical references were not allegories. They were historical facts. If the Holy Scriptures attested to the existence of giants in antiquity, then finding their descendants or other giant races in some remote corner of God's creation was entirely plausible. If the Bible and Homer both say there were giants, who were they to argue, especially when there's a very tall chap right over there wearing what appears to be an entire guanaco for a coat? Beyond classical and biblical sources, the medieval period had contributed its own rich layer of giant lore. Arthurian legends and other chivalric romances, the popular fiction of their day, frequently featured heroic knights battling fearsome giants who guarded castles or terrorized the countryside. And then there was the immensely popular, if largely fabricated, 14th century travelogue, The Travels of Sir John Mandeville. This book, which purported to be a first-hand account of journeys through the East, was a bestseller across Europe, translated into numerous languages. Mandeville described a plethora of marvels, including various monstrous races, and yes, giants of formidable size and strength, living in distant lands like India or Cathay. It was basically the 16th century equivalent of a viral internet travel blog full of amazing stories, half of which were probably cooked up over a tankard of ale, but which many readers took as gospel truth. Remember that chivalric romance, Prima Leon de Gracia, we discussed in relation to the naming of Patagonia, the one featuring the dog-headed giant Patagonian? That's another perfect example of how contemporary popular literature reinforced the idea of giants being a real possibility in unexplored territories. It's like us going to Mars and if we found some big shaggy creatures immediately thinking of Wookiees. The cultural template was already there. There was even a curious belief in some parts of medieval and Renaissance Europe that finding unusually large fossilized bones, which we now know belong to extinct megafauna like mammoths, mastodons, or even dinosaurs, were actual giants' bones, physical proof of their historical existence. If you dug up a massive femur, you weren't thinking long-extinct proboscidean. You were much more likely thinking Goliath's great-uncle Thagmor had a really bad day right here. This kind of evidence further cemented the belief. The direct influence of specific classical, biblical, or medieval romance narratives about giants on Ferdinand Magellan's personal beliefs and his interpretation of the Patagonian encounter versus a more generalized cultural acceptance of such possibilities circulating among his crew and contemporaries is difficult to trace with absolute certainty from the available historical records. Magellan wasn't exactly keeping a dream journal about which specific giant myth was on his mind, but it's undeniable that he and his men were products of a culture saturated with such stories. These tales weren't just entertainment. They formed part of their understanding of how the world worked, what it contained, and what marvels might lie just beyond the next horizon. They were, in a very real sense, preconditioned to find giants. The whispers of giants past were a constant, subtle hum in the background of their great adventure. You're now thoroughly steeped in the rich broth of ancient myths and medieval romances that simmered in the minds of Magellan and his crew, a cultural backdrop where giants were not just figures of fantasy, but plausible inhabitants of the world's unexplored edges. This pre-existing belief system was a powerful lens, but it wasn't just ancient stories and old maps that primed them to see giants in Patagonia. The very experience of their grueling, isolated voyage, the profound psychological pressures of sailing into the vast, terrifying unknown would have further magnified their perceptions and fueled their readiness to believe in the extraordinary. Fear, after all, has a remarkable way of stretching the truth in a very long shadow. Imagine yourself months at sea, completely cut off from your known world. There are no letters from home, no reassuring news from familiar shores, no way to call for help if disaster strikes. You are a tiny speck of humanity adrift on an immense indifferent ocean aboard a fragile wooden vessel. The extreme psychological pressures faced by sailors on such long voyages during the Age of Discovery were immense, including profound isolation, the constant threat of mortal danger, gnawing uncertainty about their location, and ultimate fate, and the stress of encountering utterly unfamiliar environments and peoples. This wasn't a pleasure cruise with shuffleboard and a midnight buffet. This was a relentless struggle for survival against overwhelming odds. The fear of the unknown was a constant oppressive companion. Beyond the monsters depicted on their charts, there were very real navigational dangers. They were sailing in uncharted waters with no reliable maps of currents, hidden reefs, or safe anchorages. The southern latitudes brought with them terrifying storms, mountainous waves, and bone-chilling cold. The idea of sailing off the edge of a flat Earth had largely been dispelled among educated navigators like Magellan. But for some of the less educated crew, that primal fear might still have lingered. And even if the world was round, who knew what horrors lay on its underside or at its icy extremities? Then there was the fear of what or who they might encounter on land. Would the native peoples be friendly or hostile cannibals, as so many lurid tales suggested? Would the land itself be fertile and welcoming or cursed and barren, perhaps guarded by malevolent spirits? There was a common sailor's belief in those days that certain desolate stretches of ocean, particularly those far from any known land, were haunted by phantom islands that would appear and then vanish, luring unsuspecting ships to their doom, or that the eerie, groaning sounds of shifting ice in far southern waters were the actual lamentations of trapped souls or monstrous sea beasts. It's frankly amazing they managed to get any sleep at all with all that to worry about on top of the bad food and the even worse company. In such a state of heightened anxiety and prolonged stress, human perception can become remarkably pliable. Unusual sights or sounds, things that in a more familiar or secure environment might be dismissed or rationally explained, could easily be interpreted as threatening or supernatural. A distant whale breaching might be mistaken for a sea serpent. A flock of unfamiliar birds with strange calls might seem like an ill omen. And a group of people who are notably taller than oneself, encountered in a desolate land after months of hardship and anticipation of marvels, could very easily be magnified in the mind's eye into true giants. Their version of a stress ball was probably just gripping the nearest bit of rigging very, very tightly and fervently, praying to every saint they could recall, perhaps even inventing a few new ones on the spot just for good measure. Group psychology would also have played a significant role. On a ship especially, one as isolated and stressed as Magellan's, rumors and beliefs could spread like wildfire. If one influential or highly respected crew member, say an officer or even Magellan himself, declared that they had seen a giant, or that the encountered people were indeed of colossal stature, it would be much harder for others to dissent even if their own eyes told them something slightly less dramatic. Shared fear, shared wonder, and the desire to be part of a momentous discovery could lead to a collective reinforcement of belief. If one excited sailor shouted, "Giant squirrel with flaming teeth," with enough conviction you can bet a few others would probably start seeing, or at least claiming to see similar fiery-tailed rodents, if only to be on the safe side or not miss out on the excitement. The interplay between genuine environmental dangers encountered by these early modern explorers, such as truly treacherous storms or encounters with genuinely hostile local populations, and purely imagined or psychologically projected threats, like those mythical sea monsters or wildly exaggerated human foes, in shaping their written accounts. And consequently, the European perceptions of these new worlds is a complex field of study for historical psychologists and literary analysts. It's often impossible to neatly disentangle what was objectively observed from what was subjectively experienced and then narratively embellished. Magellan himself, as the Captain General, was under unimaginable pressure. He had already faced down a bloody mutiny. He was responsible for the lives of his remaining crew and the success of an incredibly expensive and high-stakes royal expedition. Finding something truly spectacular, something to justify the immense cost in lives and resources, would have been a powerful motivator. Perhaps he too was susceptible to seeing what he and his era wanted or expected to see in this strange new world at the bottom of the globe. The desolate land, the unusual people, the heightened emotions, it was a perfect storm for the birth of a giant belief. You're now deep in the psychological landscape of Magellan's fleet wintering in that desolate Patagonian bay, a place where fear, isolation, and the powerful currents of pre-existing myths about giants have created a potent brew of heightened suggestibility. The very air seems charged with the possibility of encountering the extraordinary. But for these encounters to truly take root and become accepted fact back in Europe, Magellan and his men would need more than just their own subjective experiences or vague sailors' tales. They would need, or at least believe they had gathered some form of proof to substantiate their astonishing claims of encountering a race of giants at the world's end. In the 16th century, the concept of proof for discoveries in far-off lands was somewhat different from our modern scientifically rigorous standards. Explorers were certainly expected to bring back tangible evidence when possible. Exotic plants, unusual animals, mineral samples, or detailed maps and charts. But in an age before photography, video, or easily verifiable scientific measurements, the detailed written testimony of an educated eyewitness, particularly a nobleman or a scholar, carried immense weight. And in this Magellan's expedition was fortunate to have Antonio Pigafetta. His meticulous journal, filled with descriptions of the Patagonians, became the primary textual proof that fueled the belief in these South American giants for centuries to come. So what evidence did Pigafetta's account, and by extension Magellan's expedition, offer to a curious and marvel-hungry Europe? Firstly, there were his very specific, if, as we've discussed, likely exaggerated descriptions of their physical stature. The repeated claim that an average European man only reached the waist or chest of these individuals was a powerful, easily visualized image. His estimations of their height, whether 7, 9, or even more feet, would have been presented not as wild guesses, but as the considered observations of a man who had stood or cowered right next to them. His internal measuring tape might have been slightly influenced by the sheer awe of the encounter, but his written words would be taken as near gospel by many. Then there were the footprints. Remember the name Patagon, popularly believed to mean big feet? It's highly probable that Magellan's men, once primed by the name or by their initial sightings, would have actively looked for and perhaps readily found evidence of unusually large footprints in the sand or soft earth along the shoreline. The Tehuelche people, with their guanaco skin foot coverings, would indeed have left a larger, somewhat splayed track than a shod European. To a mind already expecting giants, these oversized prints would seem like undeniable corroboration. See, you can almost hear a sailor exclaim, "The tracks of a veritable colossus." No ordinary mortal leaves such a crater. Pigafetta's descriptions of their immense strength and their booming, bull-like voices also served as supporting evidence. Anecdotes of the captured Patagonian struggles, how it took multiple strong European sailors to subdue even one shackled giant, would be recounted with wide eyes back in Seville, further cementing their superhuman image. These weren't just tall, slender folk. These were powerful, robust beings, titans in both stature and strength according to the narrative being crafted. Did they collect any physical artifacts that seemed to belong to giants? While Pigafetta doesn't detail a museum's worth of oversized Patagonian possessions, he does describe their guanaco skin cloaks and their fur-wrapped footwear. If any samples of these were hypothetically brought back to Europe, perhaps a discarded moccasin or a piece of their attire, and they seemed unusually large or crudely fashioned to European eyes unfamiliar with their construction or intended use in a harsh climate, these too might have been presented or misinterpreted as further evidence of their owner's gigantic size. Imagine a sailor eager to impress, finding an unusually large discarded guanaco jawbone on the beach and triumphantly presenting it back on the ship. Look, lads, the very jawbone of a Patagonian child giant. They clearly start 'em young and big down here in the land of frosty receptions. Confirmation bias, as we know, can do wonders for your amateur fossil identification skills. The veracity and interpretation of such anecdotal proofs mentioned in early explorer accounts, such as reports of unusually large footprints or discarded artifacts like oversized skin cloaks attributed to the Patagonians, are often difficult to verify independently and are subject to considerable scholarly skepticism regarding their direct correlation to actual human gigantism. A large footprint in soft sand can be misleading. An animal's skin cloak designed for warmth in a frigid climate will naturally be bulky. Of course, the ultimate irrefutable proof Magellan intended to bring back was the living, breathing bodies of the two captured Patagonian men. These individuals were to be the star exhibits, the undeniable evidence that would silence all skeptics and bring glory to the expedition and its commander. Their tragic deaths at sea, as we've noted, meant that this prime piece of living evidence was lost. This loss, ironically, may have done more for the legend of the giants than their actual presentation at the Spanish court ever could have. Without the real men there to be measured and objectively assessed, however flawed that assessment might still have been by 16th century standards, their reported size and strength could inflate even further in the retelling, becoming purely mythological. The captured giants, by unfortunately not surviving their involuntary world tour, inadvertently became less like study subjects and more like martyrs to their own mythical stature. In the end, the proof of Patagonian giants rested heavily on the power of Pigafetta's narrative, the consistency of the returning sailors' tales, likely reinforcing each other's exaggerations, and the deep-seated willingness of 16th century Europeans to believe in a world still filled with wonders and marvels beyond their own shores. If enough credible people say they saw a unicorn, eventually someone is going to start selling authentic unicorn horn polish. Belief, especially in an age hungry for the extraordinary, is a remarkably powerful market force, and Magellan's men were bringing back a story that Europe was more than ready to buy. You're now standing in the rather grim aftermath of Magellan's decision to capture two Patagonian giants, an act that ensured no further peaceful gift exchanges, only mutual suspicion and hostility. The intended living proof of these colossal beings tragically perished before they could ever reach the shores of Spain and astound King Charles's court. But this loss of physical evidence paradoxically did little to dampen the burgeoning legend. In fact, it may have even fanned its flames, because what did survive and what would prove to be incredibly potent was the detailed, seemingly eyewitness account penned by our diligent Venetian chronicler Antonio Pigafetta. His vivid narrative, once it reached Europe, would ensure that the Patagonian giants didn't just fade into obscure sailors' lore. They would stride confidently onto the world stage, captivating the European imagination for centuries to come. First, however, the tattered remnants of Magellan's once proud fleet had to actually make it back. As you know, Magellan himself met his end in the Philippines in 1521, a long way from Patagonia, and an even longer way from the Spice Islands he so desperately sought via a western route. After numerous further hardships, desertions, and battles, only one of the original 5 ships, the Victoria, under the command of Juan Sebastian Elcano, finally limped back into Seville in September 1522, having achieved the first circumnavigation of the globe. And among the handful of gaunt, scurvy-ravaged survivors who stumbled ashore was Antonio Pigafetta, clutching his precious detailed journal. This journal, often titled Relazione del primo viaggio intorno al mondo, Report on the First Voyage Around the World, was an absolute sensation. While its complete, unadulterated publication would take many years, summaries, extracts, and translations into various European languages began to circulate relatively quickly. It was a riveting tale of adventure, discovery, hardship, and exotic encounters the likes of which Europe had rarely seen. And one of the most talked about, most wondrous, and most readily believed sections was, of course, the detailed description of their sojourn in Patagonia and their encounters with the giants who dwelled there. Pigafetta's detailed written account, filled with those specific, if likely exaggerated descriptions of their immense height, their bull-like voices, their fur-wrapped feet, and their simple amazement at European trinkets, became the primary evidence that fueled and cemented the belief in Patagonian giants for well over 200 years. Imagine the impact of these tales in a Europe hungry for news from the expanding world, an audience already primed by classical texts and medieval romances to believe in monstrous races and distant marvels. Pigafetta's account wasn't just a vague rumor. It was presented as the factual observation of an educated man, a knight who had been there, who had seen them with his own eyes. He wrote with a captivating blend of detail and wonder, describing their appearance, their customs as he interpreted them, their diet. He claimed they ate raw meat and drank the blood of guanacos, adding to their savage image and, of course, their astonishing size. His words painted a vivid, almost irresistible picture, and so the legend took firm hold. Mapmakers eager to fill the still vast blank spaces of South America with intriguing details began to inscribe Patagonia Regio Gigantum, Patagonia region of giants, or similar labels across the southern tip of the continent. For generations, if you looked at a map of the world, you would see this land explicitly identified as the home of giants. Subsequent explorers who ventured into those waters often went with the expectation of encountering these colossal beings, and their reports, whether confirming, modifying, or even eventually debunking the myth, kept the story alive. Figures like Sir Francis Drake and Thomas Cavendish in the late 16th century, and later voyagers in the 17th and 18th centuries, like John Byron, grandfather of the poet Lord Byron, whose account of encountering tall Patagonians earned him the nickname Foul-Weather Jack, but also briefly reignited the giant craze. All contributed their own observations, some more sober than others. Later explorers were probably a bit disappointed when they finally arrived. Right then, where are the 9-foot-tall chaps who eat raw meat and roar like bulls? These fellows are merely very, very tall and seem quite reasonable. Hardly worth writing home about. Unless, of course, I embellish my account just a tad for the folks back in London. Early European illustrations based on these textual descriptions, often created by artists who had never left their European studios, let alone seen a Patagonian, further solidified the image of the giants in the popular imagination. These depictions, sometimes appearing in editions of Pigafetta's work, or in popular collections of voyages, often showed the Patagonians with wildly exaggerated proportions, sometimes looking like giant, rather grumpy and heavily furred European peasants, or occasionally with almost comically oversized hands and feet to really lean into that Patagon etymology. One can imagine an early illustrator given a vague prompt like, "Giant lives at cold end of world wears furs," possibly shouts like "bull," coming up with something akin to a 16th century AI image generator's best slightly confused effort. The exact mechanisms by which Antonio Pigafetta's original manuscript account of the Patagonian encounter was edited, translated, summarized, and illustrated in its various early published forms, and how these processes of transmission might have subtly or overtly further shaped, emphasized, or even exaggerated the giant narrative for different European audiences, are areas of ongoing bibliographic and historical study. Each retelling, each new edition had the potential to add another layer to the legend. For over 2 centuries, the Patagonian giants had a longer and more robust run in popular European culture than many modern boy bands, and with arguably better if furrier costumes. It wasn't until more scientifically minded expeditions in the later 18th and early 19th centuries, with a greater emphasis on accurate anthropological measurement and observation, that the myth truly began to fade, replaced by a more sober understanding of the Tehuelche people as a genuinely tall but not supernaturally gigantic race. But the romance of the story, the allure of a lost land of titans at the end of the world, first brought to vivid life by Pigafetta's quill, lingered on a testament to the power of a good story and humanity's enduring fascination with the marvelous. You've now journeyed with Antonio Pigafetta's incredible tale As it swept through Europe, his vivid descriptions, and the very name Patagonian, cementing the image of a land of giants in the popular imagination for well over 2 centuries. Maps were redrawn, fireside stories were embellished, and later explorers often sailed south with the specific expectation or perhaps a hopeful dread of encountering these colossal beings. But as our sleepy exploration of why Magellan and his men believed in these giants reaches its final chapter, it's time to gently part the veils of legend and exaggeration and meet the actual indigenous inhabitants of that windswept land. The people who, through no fault of their own, became the titans of European folklore, the Tehuelche. The people Magellan's expedition encountered in 1520 at Port St. Julian, and whom they dubbed Patagones, were various nomadic groups collectively known today as the Tehuelche people or the Aonekenk, as one of their southern groups referred to themselves. These were not mythical beings from a chivalric romance or a classical epic. They were skilled hunter-gatherers, perfectly adapted to surviving and thriving in the harsh, demanding environment of Patagonia. Their lives revolved around hunting guanaco, a relative of the llama, and the flightless rhea, similar to an ostrich utilizing the bow and arrow, and very notably, the bolas, a throwing weapon made of weighted stones on interconnected cords which they used with great accuracy to entangle the legs of their prey. The sight of these flying stones, accurately bringing down large game from a distance, might have seemed almost magical, or evidence of superhuman skill to Europeans unfamiliar with the weapon, perhaps subtly adding another layer to their larger-than-life perception of these hunters. Now, what about their famous stature? Were they truly the 9 or 10-foot behemoths that Pigafetta's account and later embellishments suggested? The simple answer is no. However, the Tehuelche were by all credible anthropological accounts a genuinely tall people, especially when compared to the average height of 16th-century Europeans. Adult Tehuelche males often averaged around 8 meters or roughly 5 feet 11 inches to 6 feet, with some individuals certainly being taller, perhaps reaching 6'2", or even a bit more in exceptional cases. In an era when the average European sailor might stand closer to 5'3" or 5'5", encountering people who consistently topped 6 feet would have been undeniably striking. They weren't fee-fi-fo-fum, I smell the blood of a scurvy-ridden Englishman giants, but more like, wow, you chaps are consistently winning at basketball if basketball had been invented yet. And if we weren't all about to engage in some tragic cultural misunderstandings, tall. So, how did this significant but not supernatural height difference get magnified into the legend of true giants? Several factors likely contributed, many of which we've already touched upon. There was the initial shock and awe of encountering such physically imposing people in a strange and desolate land. There was the cultural preconditioning, the expectation of finding marvels and monsters. There was the difficulty of accurate measurement and the tendency towards exaggeration in travelers' tales. A good story was, after all, a valuable commodity. The Tehuelche's bulky clothing, those expertly sewn guanaco skin cloaks called kai or chonenque, worn with the fur, turned inwards for warmth, and their large fur-wrapped footwear sonke would have made them appear even larger and more imposing than they actually were. And of course, the power of a catchy name like Patagon, with its Bigfoot connotations, certainly helped. It turns out, they looked really tall to us relatively short, scurvy-ridden sailors who were expecting marvels. Doesn't have quite the same dramatic ring as "there be giants here." Less map-worthy, perhaps. Beyond their height, the Tehuelche had a rich culture adapted to their environment. Pigafetta noted their face painting, their short hair, and their diet, which included guanaco meat, sometimes eaten raw, according to him, which would have added to the savage image for Europeans in various routes. They were skilled artisans in working with stone bone and animal hides. Their social structure was based around nomadic family groups led by chiefs moving across the vast plains in rhythm with the seasons and the migrations of their prey. Tehuelche oral traditions, though not recorded in detail until much later, speak of their own cosmology, their spirits, and their own encounters with the first Europeans, sometimes referring to them as pale spirits or people from the sea, reflecting their own sense of encountering the strange and other. It's a poignant reminder that the wonder and probably the apprehension went both ways in those early encounters. The precise demographic makeup, linguistic variations, and intergroup relations among the various nomadic hunter-gatherer groups collectively known as the Tehuelche. In the early 16th century, prior to major European disruption, are still subjects of ongoing research and reconstruction by anthropologists and ethnohistorians, relying on limited early accounts and later archaeological and linguistic evidence. What is clear is that they were a resilient and resourceful people, the true inhabitants of that land Magellan stumbled upon. The tragedy, of course, is that the legend of the Patagonian giants often overshadowed the reality of the Tehuelche people themselves. For centuries, they were viewed through this fantastical lens more as objects of curiosity or monstrous myth than as a complex human society with their own history and culture. And like so many indigenous populations around the world subsequent European contact, the introduction of new diseases, encroachment on their lands, and violent conflict led to a drastic decline in their numbers and the eventual erosion of their traditional way of life. It's a somber footnote to a tale that began with such wide-eyed, if misguided, wonder. So as we reflect on why Magellan believed in Patagonian giants, it's crucial to remember the real people behind the myth. They were tall, yes, impressively so, to European eyes. But their true stature lay not in some supernatural height, but in their ability to live and thrive in one of the world's most challenging environments, a testament to human adaptation and endurance that in its own way is far more marvelous than any 9-foot giant of legend. And with that, our sleepy exploration of Magellan, the Patagonian giants, and the remarkable Tehuelche people who inspired the legend draws to its close. We've sailed through storms of hardship, navigated the treacherous waters of 16th century belief, and stood on the desolate shores of a land that seemed to promise monsters, but delivered instead a testament to human diversity. The echoes of Pigafetta's quill, the imagined roar of the giants, the biting Patagonian wind, all these can now soften and fade into the gentle quiet of your approaching sleep. Let the vast, empty plains of Patagonia stretch out in your mind, not as a place of fear, but as a landscape of resilience, a place where myth and reality once danced a strange, captivating jig. The figures of Magellan and his crew, and the tall, skin-clad Tehuelche, can now recede into the mists of history, their stories told. There are no more giants to seek, no more mutinies to quell, only the calm expanse of the present moment inviting you to rest. Allow any lingering thoughts of far-off lands and ancient mariners to dissolve like sea foam on a distant shore. The voyage is over and a deep, peaceful slumber awaits a quiet harbor for your drifting mind.